What if the pyramids of Giza were never meant to stand alone? What if these monuments that have defined Egypt's skyline for nearly 5,000 years were built not as isolated tombs rising from empty desert, but as markers, architectural signals pointing downward towards something far older buried beneath them? Beneath the sand that shifts in the Saharan wind, beneath the bedrock that tourists walk across without knowing what their footsteps might be echoing through, ancient texts describe something that modern archaeology has struggled to acknowledge. Entire sea cities, temple complexes, chambers stretching in networks that mirror the structures above. The accounts are not vague legends. They carry the precision of administrative records, the confidence of eyewitness description, the weight of writers who believed they were documenting what they had seen. So before the silence of the desert pulls you under, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if you're drawn to histories that ask what might still be waiting beneath surfaces we thought we understood. And if you're listening now, tell me where you are and what time it is. I'd like to imagine this quiet stretching across the world, settling like sand over sleepers who wonder what lies below. At dawn, the Sphinx emerges from darkness in stages, first the crown of its weathered head catching the earliest light, then the full mass of its limestone body becoming visible against the paling sky, and finally the long shadow it casts westward across the plateau shrinking as the sun climbs over the Nile Valley. There is something about this hour that strips away the tourist infrastructure and the modern city pressing against the plateau's edge, leaving only the monument itself in its strange solitude. A lion's body with a human face gazing eternally toward the eastern horizon. But what most visitors never notice, what photographs rarely capture and guidebooks seldom emphasize, is that the Sphinx does not rest upon the plateau, it rests within it. The monument sits in a rectangular pit carved directly into the bedrock, a trench surrounding it on all sides that drops 30 feet below the level of the surrounding desert. This is not an accident of erosion, or the gradual accumulation of sand against a freestanding sculpture. This is deliberate excavation on an enormous scale. Someone carved away hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of solid limestone to free this figure from the living rock, and the question that has troubled investigators since the earliest systematic surveys is deceptively simple. Where did all that stone go? The volume removed to create the Sphinx enclosure represents enough material to build several large temples, enough stone to construct monuments that should be visible somewhere on the plateau or its surroundings, yet no corresponding pile of quarry debris has ever been identified. The conventional explanation suggests the blocks were used in nearby construction, perhaps dragged away to build the temples and causeways that surround the pyramids. This explanation satisfies until you examine the temples themselves and discover that the stone tells a different story. One that points not outward across the plateau but downward into passages that early excavators documented but could not fully explore. In 1853, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette arrived in Egypt on a mission to collect Coptic manuscripts for the Louvre. What he found instead would transform the study of ancient Egypt and establish the institutional framework that still governs excavation at Giza today. Mariette was not looking for the Sphinx when he began his work. He was excavating at Saqqara, miles to the south, when he uncovered the avenue of sphinxes leading to the Serapeum, the underground burial complex of the sacred Apis bulls. But his success brought him authority, and that authority eventually brought him to Giza, where he conducted the first systematic investigation of the structures surrounding the Great Sphinx. What Mariette found half buried in sand on the eastern side of the Sphinx was a temple complex that had been invisible for centuries. The Valley Temple, as it came to be known, was constructed from massive limestone blocks faced with polished granite, its interior chambers stark and geometric, its architecture unlike anything from the Old Kingdom pyramid complexes nearby. Connected to this temple by a partially buried causeway was another structure, the Temple of the Sphinx itself, positioned directly in front of the monument's extended paws. Mariette's excavation notes, preserved in the archives of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, he would later direct, describe these temples in meticulous detail, but they also describe something else. In passages that subsequent scholars have largely overlooked, Mariette recorded finding openings in the bedrock floor of the Sphinx enclosure, vertical shafts and horizontal tunnels that descended into darkness beyond the reach of his lanterns. He described one passage behind the Sphinx that appeared to angle downward toward the body of the monument itself, and another near the southern wall of the enclosure that his workers could not fully clear because of flooding from the water table. His report to the Egyptian government contained a sentence that would prove prophetic. "There are chambers beneath that we cannot access. Mariette did not have the resources or the technology to pursue these underground passages. His mission was to document and preserve what lay on the surface, to establish the institutional control that would protect Egyptian antiquities from the unregulated plundering that had characterized earlier centuries of exploration. The passages he discovered were noted, measured where possible, and then largely forgotten, as attention focused on the visible monuments that tourists and scholars alike found more accessible. For 70 years, the Sphinx remained partially buried, the underground openings Mariette had documented filling with sand and debris, until a French engineer named Émile Barrès undertook the most comprehensive excavation the monument had ever received. Between 1826 and 1936, Barrès systematically cleared the entire Sphinx enclosure, removing centuries of accumulated sand to reveal the full extent of the carved bedrock trench. His photographs, preserved in the archives of the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo, show the Sphinx fully exposed for the first time in living memory, its weathered flanks and eroded pores visible in their entirety. But Barrès discovered more than eroded limestone. His excavation documented at least 3 distinct openings in the bedrock that had not been fully explored or even acknowledged in previous surveys. The most significant was a vertical shaft behind the Sphinx, positioned near the monument's haunches, that descended into the bedrock at a steep angle. Barrès' workers partially cleared this shaft, discovering that it opened into a small chamber before continuing downward through passages that became too narrow or too flooded to follow. His documentation includes measurements and sketches, but the investigation was not completed. The reasons for discontinuing the excavation remain unclear in the official record. What is documented is the institutional response. Several of the passages Barrès discovered were subsequently sealed with cement and iron grating, officially for safety reasons, to prevent accidents and unauthorized access. The documentation of these passages was not published in any systematic form, remaining instead in private archives and institutional collections where it attracted little scholarly attention. The focus remained on the visible monument, its erosion patterns, its artistic features, its relationship to the pyramid complex, while the underground openings were treated as minor features unworthy of serious investigation. But the temple that sits directly in front of the Sphinx refuses to let the underground question rest. This structure, sometimes called the Sphinx Temple to distinguish it from the nearby Valley Temple, was built from massive limestone blocks weighing dozens of tons each, blocks that geological analysis has definitively traced to the Sphinx enclosure itself. The stone removed to carve the Sphinx from the bedrock was not scattered across the plateau or lost to history. It was cut into blocks and used to build the temple directly in front of the monument's pores. The architectural implications of this are significant. If the temple was built from stone removed during the carving of the Sphinx, then the temple and the Sphinx were planned together, part of a single construction project rather than independent monuments built at different times. The temple's position, directly on axis with the Sphinx's gaze, would support this interpretation. But geological and architectural analysis reveals something more complex. The Sphinx Temple shows evidence of multiple construction phases. The massive limestone blocks that form its core are weathered in patterns that differ from the granite casing that once covered them. The foundation levels show repairs and modifications that suggest the structure was rebuilt, perhaps multiple times over older foundations whose original form can no longer be determined. What was there before the temple we can see? What lay beneath the temple before the granite casing was applied? And why does the temple, supposedly built as part of the 4th Dynasty pyramid complex around 2500 BCE, show weathering patterns that some geologists argue would require thousands of additional years to produce? These questions remained academic curiosities, debated occasionally in specialist journals but attracting little public attention, until the 1930s when an unexpected source thrust the underground passages beneath the Sphinx into popular consciousness. Edgar Cayce, an American psychic who claimed to access past life memories while in trance states, made a series of predictions about Egyptian history that focused specifically on the Giza Plateau. Cayce claimed that beneath the Sphinx lay a chamber he called the Hall of Records, a repository containing documents from a lost civilization that had flourished before the last ice age. His predictions included specific details about the location and contents of this chamber, details that attracted believers who hoped archaeological investigation would validate his claims. The historical significance of Case's predictions lies not in their accuracy, which has never been demonstrated, but in the institutional response they provoked. Before the 30s, underground exploration at Giza had been limited primarily by technology and resources, rather than explicit prohibition. After Case's predictions attracted public attention, institutional resistance to underground investigation intensified notably. Permits for subsurface surveys became more difficult to obtain. Proposals to explore the passages documented by Mariette and Berets were denied or indefinitely delayed. The official position hardened. There is nothing significant beneath the Sphinx, and investigating claims to the contrary would only validate pseudoscientific speculation. This response raises a question that the institutional framework has never adequately addressed. If there is nothing beneath the Sphinx, why not prove it? If the passages documented by 19th and early 20th century excavators lead only to empty chambers or natural voids, a thorough investigation would settle the matter permanently. If Case's predictions were unfounded fantasy, exploration would demonstrate this more effectively than any official denial. Instead, the opposite occurred. As public interest in underground exploration increased, institutional barriers to that exploration increased in parallel. Technologies that could map subsurface features without excavation became available in the 1970s, but their application at Giza was restricted, and their results disputed or suppressed. The passages that early excavators could not fully explore remained unexplored, their existence acknowledged in archived documents but absent from public discussion. The Sphinx continues to gaze eastward, its weathered face unreadable, its body resting in the deliberately carved trench that freed it from the bedrock. Around it the plateau stretches toward the pyramids, that sand covering whatever lies beneath, the morning light illuminating only what remains on the surface. Somewhere below, in darkness that has not seen light since the shafts were sealed, the passages that Mariette could not access and Berets could not complete continue in directions that have never been mapped. The question they raise is not whether the passages exist. The documentation confirms they do. The question is where they lead and why. After more than a century of increasingly sophisticated archaeological investigation, we still do not know the answer. In the year 450 BCE, a Greek traveller arrived in Egypt carrying wax tablets and an insatiable curiosity for the monuments that had already stood for over 2,000 years. His name was Herodotus, and he would later be called the father of history, though in his own time he was simply a man who walked through ancient places and wrote down what he saw and what the priests who guarded those places were willing to tell him. He spent months moving through the Nile Valley, visiting temples that tourists still photograph today, speaking with Egyptian priests whose institutional memory stretched back through dynasties whose names even then were becoming difficult to pronounce. When Herodotus returned to the Greek world, he compiled his observations into a work he called the Histories, and within Book 2 of that work he left the most detailed account of Egyptian monuments that survives from classical antiquity. Scholars over the centuries have verified many of his descriptions, finding that when he describes the dimensions of temples or the arrangement of sacred precincts, his observations match what archaeology has uncovered with surprising precision. The colossi of Memnon stand where he said they stood. The temple complexes at Karnak follow the layouts he described. The processional routes he walked can still be traced through ruins that confirm his reliability as an observer of visible structures. But Herodotus also described structures that are not visible, and it is here that modern scholarship has grown quiet, preferring silence to the discomfort of engaging with what he claimed to have witnessed. Near a body of water he called the Lake of Moeris, which modern geography identifies as Lake Karun, in the Fayum Depression. Herodotus describes visiting a structure he calls the labyrinth, and his description carries the same precision he applied to monuments we can still verify. He writes that the labyrinth contained 12 covered courts with their gates exactly opposite one another, 6 facing north and 6 facing south, all enclosed within a single wall. He writes that the structure contained 3,000 rooms in total, with 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below ground. He claims to have walked through the upper chambers himself, counting the rooms, observing the passages, noting the white stone of the construction and the carvings of figures upon the walls. He describes roofing made of stone rather than wood, which struck him as remarkable. He describes courtyards paved with coloured stone. He describes a complexity of passages so intricate that without a guide he could not have found his way. And then he writes something that modern archaeology has struggled to address. He states explicitly that the underground chambers surpass even the pyramids in their workmanship and complexity. But he was not permitted to enter them. The priests who guided him through the above-ground structure refused to allow him access to the lower levels, explaining that those chambers contained the tombs of the sacred crocodiles and of the kings who had built the labyrinth in ages past. Herodotus does not argue with this refusal. He does not claim to have seen what he was forbidden to see. He simply records what he was told and notes that the underground portion, by the testimony of those who guarded it, exceeded in complexity the visible structure above. His numbers are not vague. 1,500 rooms below ground is a specific claim. 12 courts is a specific claim. The gates opposite one another is a specific claim. This is not the language of legend or approximation. This is the language of someone who counted, who measured who, walked through halls and recorded what he observed. When in 1888, the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie arrived at Hawara in the Fayum determined to locate the labyrinth. Herodotus had described he expected to find at least the ruins of what had once been there. Petrie was methodical, rigorous, trained in the emerging scientific methods of archaeological excavation. He surveyed the site and located what appeared to be the foundation platform of an enormous structure, a vast rectangle of limestone chips and debris, covering an area that matched the scale Herodotus had described, but the structure itself was gone. The walls, the roofs, the 3,000 rooms had been quarried away in antiquity, reduced to building material for later constructions. Petrie concluded that Herodotus must have exaggerated that the structure, while impressive, had perhaps not been as vast as the Greek historian claimed, that memory and perhaps local pride had inflated the dimensions of a building that was after all no longer standing when Petrie arrived. This became the accepted scholarly position. The labyrinth had existed. It had been destroyed. Herodotus had probably overstated its complexity. Case closed. But Petrie's excavation focused almost entirely on the surface remains. He did not excavate beneath the foundation platform. He noted in his reports that the foundations appear to continue deeper than expected, but he lacked the resources, the time, and perhaps the inclination to pursue what lay below. The underground chambers Herodotus described with such precision, the 1,500 rooms beneath the visible structure, the passages containing royal tombs and sacred crocodiles, were never investigated. Later surveys of the Hawara site have been limited, contested, and politically complicated. The Egyptian government has understandably maintained control over excavation permits, and priorities have focused on other sites. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent decades have detected anomalies beneath the platform suggesting the presence of cavities and structures, but systematic excavation has not been permitted. The underground portion of the labyrinth, the portion Herodotus said exceeded the pyramids in complexity, remains today exactly as it was in his time, unexplored and inaccessible. And Herodotus was not alone in his testimony. 400 years after his visit, the Greek geographer Strabo arrived in Egypt during the reign of Augustus, and he too made the journey to the labyrinth site. His description, written around 25 BC, parallels that of Herodotus in essential details. He describes a complex of courts and chambers. He describes passages winding through the structure, and he adds a detail that Herodotus did not emphasize. Strabo states that the underground section was deliberately made inaccessible, that the passages had been designed to confuse, that the chambers below were intended to remain hidden. He describes passages that wind through the darkness, connecting chambers that visitors were forbidden to enter. Two independent sources separated by 4 centuries, both Greek, both travellers, both writing for audiences back home, describe the same underground complex in the same location with the same essential characteristics. They describe above-ground structures they personally witnessed and underground structures they were forbidden to see, but which the priests who maintained the site confirmed existed. If Herodotus alone had made these claims, we might dismiss them as misunderstanding or exaggeration. But Strabo, writing 4 centuries later without access to archaeological confirmation, without ground-penetrating radar, without any means of knowing what lay beneath the surface, reports the same tradition. The priests were still telling the same story, the underground chambers were still being described, the prohibition against entering them was still being enforced. Either Egyptian priests maintained a fictional tradition for 400 years, telling Greek visitors the same invented story about underground chambers that did not exist, or something was actually there, and here is where the labyrinth connects to the broader question of underground Egypt. Because Herodotus did not limit his descriptions of subterranean structures to the Fayum, he also wrote about Giza. In Book 2 of the Histories, he describes the pyramids at length, providing measurements and construction accounts that scholars have debated for centuries. But embedded within his description is a claim that modern archaeology has largely ignored. Herodotus writes that the pyramids were built over underground chambers. He describes a subterranean channel bringing water from the Nile to the pyramid site, and he makes a claim that contradicts everything conventional Egyptology has taught for the past century. He states that the body of Cheops the pharaoh we call Khufu lies not within the pyramid itself, but in a chamber beneath it, a chamber surrounded by water made island-like by the canal that was cut from the river. Modern archaeology maintains that Khufu's body, if it was ever placed in the Great Pyramid, rested in the so-called King's Chamber high within the structure. The underground chamber that does exist beneath the Great Pyramid is considered unfinished, abandoned, a mistake in the construction process. The idea of a water-filled chamber surrounding a royal tomb is dismissed as Herodotus misunderstanding what the priest told him or the priests themselves, confusing tradition with reality. But has this been investigated? The subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid descends deep into the bedrock. Its purpose remains genuinely uncertain. The passage leading to it was blocked in antiquity, and when modern explorers finally cleared it, they found a rough-hewn chamber that appeared incomplete. But incomplete is an interpretation, not a fact. The chamber could have been stripped. It could have been deliberately left unfinished as camouflage. It could connect to other passages that have not been found. The water channel Herodotus describes would have had to exist below the level of the current chamber, and no excavation has gone that deep. We have assumed Herodotus was wrong rather than investigating whether he might have been right. The priests who spoke to Herodotus maintained institutional memory stretching back over 2,000 years. They had records, they had oral traditions passed from generation to generation within temple complexes that functioned continuously across centuries. When they told Herodotus that Khufu lay beneath the pyramid in a water-surrounded chamber, they were not guessing. They were transmitting what their institutions had preserved. Perhaps they were wrong. Perhaps the tradition had become garbled across the millennia between Khufu's burial and Herodotus's visit. But perhaps not. Perhaps they were describing something that had been known but was no longer accessible, something that later dynasties could no longer reach, but still remembered something that lay beneath the structures we have explored in chambers we have never entered. Herodotus and Strabo were not mystics, they were not speculators. They were educated travellers who visited Egypt and wrote down what they saw and what they were told by people who had institutional reasons to know. Their descriptions of visible monuments have proven accurate where archaeology has been able to test them. Their descriptions of underground structures have not been tested because we have not looked. The labyrinth site at Hawara sits above unexplored foundations. The Great Pyramid sits above chambers whose full extent remains unknown. The question is not whether Herodotus was reliable. The question is whether we have been willing to follow his testimony to its conclusion. If his descriptions of visible Egypt match archaeological reality, why do we assume his descriptions of underground Egypt must be false? Is the problem that he was wrong? Or is the problem that we have not yet looked? In December of 1881, French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero entered the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara and discovered something that would transform our understanding of ancient Egyptian belief. For carved into the walls of the burial chamber were vertical columns of hieroglyphic text painted in blue-green pigment, the oldest religious writings ever found, dating to approximately 2350 BCE, when Unas ruled as the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty. These inscriptions, now called the Pyramid Texts, contained over 800 individual utterances describing in precise detail the journey the pharaoh would undertake after death. And what struck Maspero immediately was not the spiritual content but the architectural specificity of the descriptions. The texts did not speak in vague metaphors about ascending to heaven or joining the gods in some undefined celestial realm. Instead, they described corridors with measured lengths, chambers with specific orientations, gates that required passwords to pass, guardians stationed at exact locations, waterways that must be crossed, and fields that must be traversed in particular directions. The language read less like prayer and more like instruction, less like poetry and more like a navigation manual for someone who would actually walk these passages. Modern Egyptology has interpreted these texts as descriptions of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, understood as a spiritual realm through which the soul travels during the 12 hours of the night before emerging reborn with the morning sun. This interpretation treats the architectural details as symbolic, the gates representing spiritual tests, the corridors representing stages of transformation, the chambers representing states of consciousness. But this interpretation requires assuming the ancient Egyptians wrote with deliberate imprecision that when they said the pharaoh descends 30 cubits and turns to the west, they meant something other than descending 30 cubits and turning west. The pyramid texts themselves resist this interpretation, for they describe the same spaces with the same measurements across different pyramids, copied by different scribes in different centuries, maintaining consistent geography as though referring to something fixed, something that existed independently of the texts describing it. The tradition did not end with the Old Kingdom, but expanded through subsequent eras, each generation adding detail to the description of the underground realm. The coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, painted on wooden coffins rather than pyramid walls, extended the Duat descriptions to non-royal burials and included something remarkable that the earlier pyramid texts lacked: actual maps. The Book of Two Ways, found on coffins from the necropolis of Deir el-Bersha, presents a diagram of the underworld showing two paths through the realm of the dead, one by land and one by water, with landmarks identified along each route, obstacles marked, and destinations labelled. These are not abstract symbols, but functional maps, the kind of document you create when you need to guide someone through actual terrain. The map shows a rectangular structure divided into registers, gates marked with circles, waterways drawn in wavy lines, and text labels identifying the Lake of Fire, the House of Flames, the Field of Offerings, and the various demons and guardians stationed at each location. If this is purely symbolic geography, it is remarkably consistent, for the same features appear in the same relative positions across different coffins from different tombs, as though the artists were copying from a standard reference rather than inventing freely. The Book of the Dead, which emerged in the New Kingdom and became the standard funerary text for over a millennium now, continued this tradition of architectural description, including the famous Spell 125 describing the Hall of Two Truths, where the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. The hall is described with pillars, a throne, specific deities standing in specific positions, and 42 judges arranged in rows, each presiding over a particular sin the deceased must deny. The scene is depicted in countless papyri with remarkable consistency, as though the artists were illustrating something they had been taught looked a particular way, not something they were free to imagine. The most detailed descriptions of the Duat appear in the royal tombs of the New Kingdom, carved on the walls of the Valley of the Kings between approximately 1550 and 1070 BCE. The Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Amduet, and similar texts divide the underworld into 12 divisions corresponding to the 12 hours of the night, and each division is described with extraordinary precision. The fifth hour, for example, describes a sandbar over which the solar bark must be hauled, the exact number of gods pulling the ropes, the name of the snake that threatens from the water, and the words that must be spoken to pass safely. The sixth hour describes the deepest point of the journey, a chamber containing a mound within which lies Sokar, the god of the Giza necropolis, surrounded by a serpent named Mehen, whose body forms protective coils around the sacred space. The texts describe this chamber as located beneath sand, accessible only to those who know the correct words, guarded by entities that will destroy the unprepared. The seventh hour describes the chamber of Osiris, where the god's body lies in darkness, where regeneration occurs, where the secret of resurrection is preserved. Hour by hour, chamber by chamber, gate by gate, the texts walk the reader through an underground complex of extraordinary sophistication, and the descriptions never change across centuries of copying. New Kingdom scribes reproduced the same geography their Middle Kingdom predecessors had recorded, and Middle Kingdom scribes had maintained the same details found in Old Kingdom texts. This consistency suggests reference to something fixed rather than theological innovation, for religious imagery typically evolves and elaborates over time, while these descriptions remained architecturally stable across more than 1,000 years. The location of this underground realm is not left vague in the texts. The Egyptian word Rostau appears repeatedly in underworld literature, and Egyptologists have long identified Rostau with the Giza Plateau. The connection is explicit in numerous texts, most notably in inscriptions from the New Kingdom that describe Rostau as the entrance to the hidden ways of the Duat, the place where the god Osiris dwells in the secret places beneath the earth. A stela from the reign of Thutmose IV describes the Sphinx as standing upon the sacred ground of Rostau, and texts from the Temple of Isis at Giza identify the area between the Sphinx and the pyramids as the entrance to the underworld kingdom. The Book of the Dead includes spells specifically for navigating Rostau, describing gates of stone that open to revealed words, passages that descend into darkness, and chambers containing water that must be crossed. The texts describe the deceased entering through a passage near the Sphinx, descending through stone corridors, passing gates guarded by serpents and demons, and eventually reaching the Chamber of Osiris in the deepest level where regeneration occurs. If these descriptions are purely symbolic, they are oddly specific about location. For other sacred sites in Egypt are described in quite different terms, while Rostau consistently appears as the primary entrance to the architectural underworld. The texts do not describe the Duat as accessible from just anywhere but specifically from this plateau, specifically from the area between the Sphinx and the pyramids, specifically through passages that descend through stone into chambers beneath the sand. The god Sokar, who appears in the deepest division of the Duat texts, is explicitly associated with the Giza necropolis. His name may derive from an ancient epithet meaning he who is upon his sand, and his primary cult centre was at Memphis, the city that served Giza as its administrative capital. The Amduat describes the Chamber of Sokar as the most restricted and dangerous portion of the underworld, accessible only to the sun god during his nightly journey, and absolutely forbidden to the ordinary dead. The chamber is described as an oval enclosure, surrounded by protective serpents, containing a mound upon which Sokar rests in the form of a hawk-headed deity. Beneath this mound lies what the texts call the body of the First One, a phrase that has puzzled scholars because it appears to reference something older than Osiris, some original divine form that predates the mythology of the texts themselves. The chamber is described as existing in darkness so profound that even the sun god cannot illuminate it, can only pass through it without seeing what lies within. The protective serpent Mehen, whose coiled body surrounds the sacred space, is described as permitting entry only to those who know the secret words, and the texts record these words without explaining their meaning, as though the scribes were copying formulas whose original significance had been lost. If this is mythology, it is mythology of an unusual kind, for it describes a location, specifies protections, mentions something buried within, and includes passwords without explaining them. These are all characteristics of a tradition that may once have described actual practice rather than purely spiritual belief. The physical monuments at Giza contain architectural features that correspond suggestively to these textual descriptions. The Great Pyramid contains a documented underground chamber, the so-called subterranean chamber, carved deep into the bedrock beneath the pyramid's base. A descending passage leads down from the entrance at an angle of approximately 26 degrees, travelling through the pyramid's limestone courses and then continuing through the bedrock itself until it reaches a chamber roughly 100 feet below ground level. This chamber appears unfinished, with rough walls and an irregular floor, but a shaft descends even further from the chamber floor, and horizontal passages extend from the chamber into the surrounding rock. The purposes of these features have never been adequately explained, and the passages have never been fully explored. The Queen's Chamber, located higher in the pyramid, contains two shafts extending at angles through the pyramid's mass, and in '93 a robot camera discovered that one of these shafts terminates not at the pyramid's exterior but at a small stone door with copper fittings. What lies behind this door has been the subject of limited investigation, and the results have not been fully published. The pyramid's grand gallery, with its corbelled ceiling and peculiar architectural features, contains a grotto carved into the bedrock, accessible through a well shaft that descends from the gallery level. The grotto appears to be a natural cave enlarged by human hands, and its presence has never been satisfactorily explained within standard theories of the pyramid's construction. Each of these features, the descending passage, the underground chamber, the unexplored shafts, the hidden door, the grotto connecting to the bedrock, corresponds to descriptions in the Duat texts of passages that descend, chambers beneath the earth, gates with hardware, and caves in the sacred space. The question that emerges from this evidence is not whether the ancient Egyptians believed in an underworld beneath the Giza Plateau, for the texts make clear they did, but rather what relationship that belief had to physical reality. Modern scholarship treats the Duat as purely spiritual, a metaphorical geography describing the soul's transformation after death, and the texts as theological compositions expressing abstract beliefs in narrative form. This interpretation is reasonable and dominant, but it requires explaining why the descriptions remained so architecturally consistent across centuries. why the location was specified so precisely as Rostau rather than left vague, why the texts include measurements and directions and passwords rather than purely spiritual imagery, and why the physical monuments at the specified location contain unexplored underground features that correspond to the textual descriptions. The alternative interpretation, that the texts describe actual underground structures that the ancient Egyptians believed existed beneath Giza, would require systematic investigation of those structures to evaluate. Such investigation has been limited, contested, and politically complicated. The underground passages and chambers that do exist have not been fully explored. The shafts and voids that technology has detected have not been excavated. The relationship between the textual tradition and the physical reality remains unexamined, because the physical reality remains largely inaccessible. If the Egyptian religious texts describe the underworld with architectural precision, and if those texts specifically identify the Giza Plateau as the entrance to that underworld, and if the monuments at Giza contain documented underground passages that have never been fully explored, then the question becomes whether we are reading mythology or archaeology. Were the scribes describing what they believed, or were they describing what they knew? Recording in religious language the memory of actual structures that their ancestors had built, maintained, and eventually sealed, leaving only the textual tradition to preserve what lies beneath. In 1858, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette was excavating the temple ruins near the Great Sphinx when his workers uncovered a limestone stela that would become one of the most contentious artifacts in Egyptology. The stela now rests in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, catalogued as JE 2091, and measures roughly 70 centimeters tall, with hieroglyphic text covering its polished surface. What Mariette found inscribed on that stone was a declaration attributed to Khufu himself, the pharaoh whom conventional history credits with building the Great Pyramid, and the text contained statements that, if taken at face value, would require rewriting everything we think we know about the Giza Plateau. The inscription describes Khufu not as a builder starting from bare desert, but as a restorer arriving at a site already sacred, already developed, already ancient. He describes finding the Sphinx and the temple beside it in a damaged state and undertaking repairs to restore them to their former condition. He describes the House of Isis as a structure whose origins predated his own reign by an unspecified but clearly substantial period. Most significantly, he describes building his pyramid beside these existing monuments not as the first construction at the site, but as an addition to a complex that was already there. The language is administrative and precise in the manner of royal inscriptions meant to document specific actions taken by specific kings. Khufu is claiming credit for restoration, not creation, and the implication is unavoidable. If this text is accurate, the Sphinx stood on the Giza Plateau before the 4th dynasty arrived and before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was ever laid, the mainstream Egyptological response to the inventory. Stela has been dismissal. Scholars date the physical artifact not to Khufu's reign around 2560 BCE, but to the 26th dynasty more than 2,000 years later, around 670 to 525 BCE. They argue that late-period priests created the stela as what they call a pious fraud, fabricating a connection between their temple and the legendary builder of the Great Pyramid to enhance their own prestige and attract pilgrims. The text is treated as mythology dressed in historical costume, a religious invention rather than a genuine record. This interpretation has become so standard that most Egyptology textbooks mention the inventory stela only to explain why it should be ignored. But the dismissal itself raises questions that the conventional interpretation struggles to answer. If late-period priests wanted to fabricate a connection to Khufu, why would they invent a story claiming he found the Sphinx already existing? Why would they diminish his achievement by making him a restorer rather than a creator? Fraudulent inscriptions typically aggrandize the past, not complicate it. A priest seeking to enhance his temple's prestige would logically claim that Khufu built everything from nothing, demonstrating divine power and establishing the site's legitimacy from the most ancient possible origin. Instead, the inventory. Stela does the opposite. It suggests Khufu arrived at a site with a history he himself could not fully trace, and that his contribution, however magnificent, was merely a chapter in a much longer story. This is a strange sort of fraud. It reads less like propaganda and more like preservation of a tradition the priests themselves had inherited. The question of the Sphinx age extends beyond textual evidence into the bedrock itself. In 1980, the Boston University geologist Robert Schoch conducted a detailed geological survey of the Sphinx enclosure, examining the erosion patterns on the limestone walls surrounding the monument. What he found contradicted the established timeline in ways that have never been satisfactorily explained. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure display deep vertical fissures and undulating weathering patterns that Schoch identified as characteristic of water erosion, specifically the kind of erosion caused by sustained rainfall over extended periods. This is fundamentally different from the erosion patterns visible on other structures at Giza, which show the horizontal layering typical of wind and sand abrasion. The Sphinx enclosure walls look like they were carved by water running down their surfaces for centuries, leaving the distinctive marks that hydrologists recognize from cliff faces in rainy climates. But Egypt has not experienced sustained heavy rainfall since the end of the African humid period around 5000 BCE. Before that time, the Sahara was green. Lakes covered regions now buried in sand. Rivers flowed where only dust blows today. If the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure were created by rainfall, then the enclosure must have existed during that earlier climatic epoch. The mathematics become uncomfortable. If the Sphinx was carved before 5000 BCE, it predates dynastic Egypt by at least 2000 years. It would belong to an era for which we have no historical records, no known civilization capable of such monumental construction, no framework for understanding who might have created it and why. Schoch presented his findings at the Geological Society of America in 1991, and the response from the geological community was notably different from the response of Egyptologists. Geologists found his methodology sound and his conclusions consistent with the physical evidence. The vertical erosion patterns are there. They can be photographed, measured, and compared to erosion patterns in other environments. The stone itself preserves the record of what shaped it. Egyptologists, however, rejected Schoch's conclusions not on geological grounds, but on historical ones. There is no evidence, they argued, for a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx before 3000 BCE. The absence of archaeological evidence for such a civilization means the geological evidence must be explained some other way. Various alternative explanations have been proposed. Perhaps the erosion was caused by Nile flooding during exceptional inundation years. Perhaps it was caused by groundwater seepage from the water table below. Perhaps the limestone composition at the Sphinx location is simply more susceptible to weathering than limestone elsewhere at Giza. Each of these explanations has problems. Nile floods do not reach the elevation of the Sphinx enclosure. Groundwater seepage would produce different erosion patterns rising from below rather than descending from above. And the limestone at the Sphinx site is not notably different in composition from limestone showing wind erosion elsewhere on the plateau. Schoch's hypothesis has not been refuted. It has simply been resisted, and the resistance appears to derive not from superior geological analysis, but from the implications of accepting what the geology suggests. If the Sphinx is as old as the erosion patterns indicate, then we do not understand the prehistory of Egypt as well as we thought, and that uncertainty extends to everything the Sphinx is connected to, including whatever might lie beneath it. The temple immediately in front of the Sphinx adds another layer of architectural anomaly. This structure, called the Sphinx Temple, or the Valley Temple of the Sphinx, depending on which archaeologist is speaking, was constructed using some of the largest stone blocks in all of Egypt. Individual blocks weigh as much as 200 tons, quarried from the very bedrock of the Sphinx enclosure, and moved into position with precision we cannot fully explain. The construction style differs markedly from confirmed 4th Dynasty architecture. The blocks are massive, rough, and fitted together with minimal finishing. They appear almost megalithic in character, resembling the cyclopean walls of much later Mediterranean civilizations or the foundations of structures at the sites like Baalbek in Lebanon. Over these rough limestone blocks, someone later applied a facing of polished granite, creating the finished appearance the temple displayed in its completed form. Some researchers have argued that this represents two distinct construction phases. The first phase would have involved quarrying and positioning the enormous limestone blocks during an earlier period. The second phase would have involved the 4th Dynasty adding granite sheathing to an existing structure, incorporating an older monument into their own building program. This interpretation remains controversial, but it is consistent with the inventory stealer's claim that Khufu found the temple already existing. If he inherited a massive but unfinished or damaged limestone structure, he might well have completed it with granite facing, claiming the finished work as his own. The technology required to move 200-ton blocks is not obviously within the 4th Dynasty's demonstrated capabilities, The other confirmed constructions of the period, while impressive, use smaller blocks and different techniques. But if the temple core predates the 4th dynasty, if it belongs to the same era as the original Sphinx, then the technological question shifts. We would be asking what civilization possessed such capabilities before 5000 BCE, and that question remains unanswered. A causeway runs from the Sphinx temple toward the complex containing Khafra's pyramid, and the alignment of this causeway presents its own puzzle. 4th dynasty causeways typically run in straight lines connecting mortuary temples to their associated pyramids in direct geometric relationship. The Sphinx causeway does not follow this pattern. It angles and curves as if following an older path rather than establishing a new one. The alignment suggests that the causeway was fitted to existing topography or existing structures, rather than imposed upon the landscape according to a unified plan. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 90s detected void spaces beneath sections of this causeway. These voids have not been excavated. Their nature remains unknown. They could be natural cavities in the limestone bedrock. They could be collapsed tunnels. They could be deliberately constructed passages connecting underground chambers. The refusal to investigate is itself significant. If the voids are natural, their excavation would confirm this and close the question. If they are something else, excavation would reveal what. The decision to leave them unexplored while declaring with certainty that nothing significant lies beneath is a peculiar position for scientists to occupy. It places institutional certainty ahead of empirical investigation. The Egyptian concept of the horizon provides additional textual context that complicates the conventional timeline. The Giza Plateau is called Aket Khufu in ancient texts, meaning the horizon of Khufu. This designation appears throughout Middle and New Kingdom sources, establishing the plateau as inextricably linked to the builder of the Great Pyramid. But earlier references exist that describe the horizon without Khufu's name. These references appear in religious texts describing the journey of the sun through the underworld and the geography of the Duat. They describe the horizon as a sacred location, a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a place where passage between realms was possible. The terminology suggests that the horizon was a recognized sacred precinct before Khufu claimed it. He did not create the sacred site. He appropriated an existing designation, adding his name to a location already charged with religious significance. If this interpretation is correct, then whatever structures existed at the horizon before the 4th dynasty would have possessed the same sacred character. Khufu built his pyramid not on empty ground, but on ground already consecrated by generations of ritual use. And if the surface structures predated him, what about the structures below the surface? The Duat itself is described as an underground realm. If the horizon marked the entrance to the Duat, and if the horizon existed before Khufu, then the underground architecture, the Egyptians associated with that entrance, might be older than the pyramids by millennia. The Egyptians depicted the horizon through the image of Aker, a double lion god shown as 2 lions sitting back to back with the sun disk rising or setting between them. This symbol appears throughout Egyptian art and religious texts, representing the boundary between yesterday and tomorrow, between the world above and the world below. Some researchers have noted that the Sphinx, with its lion body and Eastern orientation, represents 1/2 of an acre symbol. The question naturally arises, where is the other lion? Egyptian iconography consistently shows acre as a pair. A single lion would be incomplete. Speculation has persisted since at least the 19th century that a second Sphinx might exist buried beneath the sand somewhere west of the current monument, completing the acre pair and facing the setting sun as the visible Sphinx faces the rising sun. No such structure has been found on the surface. But the ground-penetrating radar surveys that detected voids beneath the Sphinx enclosure and causeway have not comprehensively mapped the western areas of the plateau. If a second Sphinx exists buried beneath accumulated sand and debris, it would presumably connect to the same underground network as the visible Sphinx. Passages might run between them. Chambers might lie beneath both. The Hall of Acre, described in funerary texts as a location in the Duat, where the deceased must pass between the 2 lions, might not be metaphor. It might be architecture. This remains speculation. No physical evidence confirms a second Sphinx. The textual references are suggestive but not definitive. What is not speculation is the pattern that emerges when we examine all of this evidence together. The inventory, DA. Stella claims Khufu found the Sphinx already existing. The erosion patterns suggest the Sphinx enclosure was carved during a period of heavy rainfall that ended around 5000 BCE. The Sphinx temple uses construction techniques different from confirmed 4th dynasty work and may represent an older structure that was later sheathed in granite. The causeway alignment suggests it followed an existing path rather than establishing a new one. The horizon was a sacred designation before Khufu appropriated it. And the acre symbolism implies that the Sphinx may be only half of a paired monument whose other half remains undiscovered. Each element individually can be explained away. The stela can be called a fraud. The erosion can be attributed to unknown geological processes. The temple construction can be reconciled with 4th dynasty capabilities if we adjust our assumptions. The causeway alignment can be called coincidence. The horizon text can be read as pure mythology. The second Sphinx can be dismissed as fantasy. But the convergence of all these anomalies at a single site demands either an extraordinarily unlikely sequence of coincidences or a simpler explanation. Something was at Giza before the 4th dynasty arrived. The pyramids were built not on empty desert, but on a sacred precinct with a history extending back into periods we call prehistoric. And if that precinct contained surface structures that the 4th dynasty inherited and incorporated and claimed as their own, then it almost certainly contained underground structures as well. Because the Egyptians who described this site did not describe only temples and monuments standing in the sun. They described the Duat, they described the underworld. They described passages descending into darkness and chambers where the sun travelled through the night. They described an architecture of depth, and they placed the entrance to that architecture here at the horizon, at the place where the lions guard the boundary between the living and the dead, between what rises and what descends. If the surface structures are older than we'd acknowledge, then the underground structures might be older still. The pyramids in this reading would not be origins, they would be markers. Monuments built by the 4th dynasty to claim a site whose true significance lay not above the ground where tourists walk today, but below it in passages that ancient texts describe with precision that modern archaeology has declined to investigate. The inventory. Stela sits in its case in Cairo. The erosion patterns remain carved into the limestone. The massive blocks of the Sphinx temple wait in their cyclopean arrangement. The text describing the horizon and the Duat and the Hall of Echo remain in museums and archives. The evidence has been there for generations. The question is whether we will ever allow ourselves to ask what it means and whether we will ever descend the passages it implies and discover what the 4th dynasty found when they arrived at a site they claimed but did not create. In 1907, a team from Stanford Research Institute arrived at the Giza Plateau carrying equipment that could see through stone, electrical resistivity meters capable of detecting variations in the density of rock beneath the surface, and their mission was straightforward: to map the subsurface geology around the Sphinx and determine whether the anomalies suggested by earlier investigations had any basis in measurable reality. The team set up their instruments in the enclosure surrounding the Sphinx, driving probes into the bedrock, sending electrical currents through the limestone and measuring how those currents behaved as they passed through different densities of material. What they found was not ambiguous. Directly beneath the front paws of the Sphinx, the instruments detected a rectangular anomaly, a cavity where the electrical resistance dropped sharply, indicating an absence of solid stone. The dimensions were consistent with a chamber, not a natural void, but something with regular geometry, something carved. Behind the Sphinx, descending at an angle toward the rear haunches, they detected another anomaly, this one suggesting a passage or corridor leading downward into the bedrock at approximately a 25-degree slope. The team documented their findings, prepared their preliminary report, and submitted their request to continue the investigation with more detailed surveys and eventually physical excavation. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization reviewed the request and declined. The project was discontinued. The anomalies remained unexplored. The official reason given was that the methodology was inconclusive and further work was unnecessary. The data, however, told a different story, and the data did not go away. 14 years later, in 1991, geologist Robert Schoch and geophysicist Thomas de Beckie returned to the Sphinx enclosure with seismographic equipment, technology that had advanced considerably since the SRI survey and could map subsurface features with greater resolution and precision. Schoch was primarily investigating the erosion patterns on the Sphinx itself, patterns he believed indicated water weathering from sustained rainfall rather than wind and sand, which would push the date of the Sphinx's carving back thousands of years before the 4th dynasty. But while he was there, Debicki conducted a systematic seismic survey of the bedrock, sending vibrations into the limestone and measuring how they bounced back from density changes below. The results confirmed what SRI had detected in 1978. There was a cavity beneath the front paws, rectangular in shape, approximately 10 feet below the surface. But Debicki also detected additional anomalies that the earlier survey had not mapped with such clarity. Beneath the body of the Sphinx itself, running along its length, there appeared to be multiple voids, not random geological pockets but regular shapes suggesting carved chambers. Most intriguing was a linear anomaly extending from the Sphinx enclosure toward the Valley Temple to the southeast, a pattern consistent with a passage or tunnel connecting the two structures underground. Schoch and Debicki documented everything meticulously. They published their findings in academic forums. They submitted formal requests for permission to excavate, to drill small exploratory holes that would confirm whether the seismic anomalies corresponded to actual chambers. The requests were denied. Egyptian authorities stated that the Sphinx area was too sensitive for invasive investigation, and that the seismic data could be explained by natural geological variation. No excavation was permitted. The anomalies remained sealed beneath the stone, and the team returned to the United States with data, but no answers. In 1996, a team from Florida State University conducted what remains one of the most detailed ground-penetrating radar surveys ever performed at Giza. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring how they reflect off subsurface features, creating something like an underground ultrasound image that can detect voids, chambers, and density variations to considerable depth. The Florida State team focused their survey on the Sphinx enclosure, particularly the area behind the monument where earlier surveys had detected the descending passage. What they found exceeded expectations. Approximately 25 feet beneath the rear of the Sphinx, the radar detected a large chamber, not a small void or natural pocket, but a defined rectangular space measuring roughly 30 feet by 40 feet. The walls of the chamber appeared regular, suggesting carved construction rather than geological formation. But the chamber was not isolated. The radar detected two passages leading away from it, tunnels or corridors extending in different directions. One passage appeared to head north, toward the Great Pyramid itself. The other headed roughly east, possibly connecting to the network that earlier surveys had suggested ran toward the Valley Temple. The team compiled their data into a comprehensive report documenting the chamber dimensions, the passage orientations, and the depth measurements. They submitted their findings to Egyptian authorities along with a proposal for minimally invasive investigation. Perhaps fiber optic cameras lowered through small drill holes that would not damage the monument or destabilize the bedrock. The proposal was rejected. The chamber beneath the Sphinx, if it exists, remains sealed. No camera has peered into its darkness, no researcher has measured its walls. The radar data sits in academic archives, unrefuted but unexplored. Meanwhile, inside the Great Pyramid itself, a parallel mystery was unfolding. In 1993, German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink was hired by the Egyptian Antiquities Organization to improve ventilation in the Queen's Chamber by clearing debris from the small shafts that extend from its walls. These shafts, approximately 8 inches square, had long puzzled researchers. They do not exit the pyramid. They simply stop somewhere inside the monument's mass, their purpose unknown. Gantenbrink designed a small robot called Upuaut, equipped with a camera and lights, to crawl up these shafts and document what lay beyond the accumulated debris. On March 22, 1993, the robot reached the end of the southern shaft, approximately 200 feet from the Queen's Chamber, and transmitted images that have haunted Egyptology ever since. The shaft terminated not in solid stone but in a small door, a slab of limestone fitted with 2 copper pins or handles, corroded green with age. No one had seen this door before. No one knew what lay behind it. The implications were profound. The shafts were not ventilation passages or symbolic pathways. They led somewhere. They were sealed. Something was on the other side. Gantenbrink's discovery made international news. Researchers speculated about hidden chambers, burial goods, or archive rooms preserved behind the sealed door. But when Gantenbrink requested permission to continue his investigation, to drill through the door or send cameras through the copper fittings, his permit was revoked. He was effectively banned from working in Egypt. The robot was impounded. For nearly a decade, no further investigation was permitted. When exploration finally resumed in 2002, a subsequent robot drilled through the first door only to discover a second door a few inches behind it, itself blocked with another stone slab. The shafts may lead to undiscovered chambers. They may connect to the larger underground network that other surveys have detected. But investigation has been minimal. Results have been published incompletely, and the doors remain effectively unexplored. Then came 2017 and the Scan Pyramids project, an international collaboration using muon tomography to peer inside the Great Pyramid without drilling, cutting, or in any way disturbing the structure. Muons are subatomic particles produced when cosmic rays strike Earth's atmosphere. They pass through solid matter, but they pass through voids more easily. By placing detectors around a structure and measuring how muons behave as they pass through, researchers can map density variations inside, creating a kind of X-ray image of the entire monument. The Scan Pyramids team placed detectors inside the Queen's chamber and around the pyramid's exterior, collecting data over several months. When they analysed the results, they found something that the Egyptian authorities initially refused to believe. Above the Grand Gallery, in a space where conventional plans showed only solid limestone, there was a void, not a small pocket or construction gap, but a substantial cavity at least 100 feet long, comparable in size to the Grand Gallery itself. The void appeared to run roughly parallel to the gallery, slightly above it, its purpose completely unknown. Additional smaller voids were detected throughout the pyramid's mass, suggesting a more complex internal architecture than anyone had documented. The team published their findings in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The data was peer-reviewed, replicated, and confirmed by the independent analysis. The void exists. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities initially disputed the interpretation, suggesting the anomaly might represent gaps between construction blocks rather than a distinct chamber, but subsequent studies have confirmed the void's existence, its dimensions, and its regular geometry. As of now, more than half a decade after its discovery, no physical investigation has been conducted, no cameras have been inserted, no drilling has been attempted. The largest undiscovered space in the Great Pyramid since the 19th century sits unexplored, while authorities debate whether exploring it is necessary. This pattern of detection followed by resistance is not unique to any single survey. It appears consistently across decades of investigation. In 1978, anomalies were detected, and the project was discontinued. In 1991, cavities were confirmed and excavation was denied. In 1996, a chamber was mapped, and the proposal was rejected. In 1993, a sealed door was discovered, and the researcher was banned. In 2017, a massive void was confirmed, and no investigation has followed. Each technology was different, each team was different, each set of findings was independently produced and documented. Yet the institutional response has been remarkably consistent. Anomalies are acknowledged in preliminary reports, then minimised in official statements. Requests for investigation are denied on grounds of monument preservation, methodological uncertainty, or simple bureaucratic delay. Results are disputed just enough to create doubt without actually refuting the data. And the underground structures that multiple independent surveys have detected remain exactly where they have always been, beneath the sand and stone, unmeasured, unexamined, unexplored. The official position of Egyptian authorities is that all significant discoveries at Giza have already been made. The pyramids and Sphinx have been studied for centuries. There are no hidden chambers of consequence. The anomalies detected by various surveys represent natural geological features or gaps in construction, rather than deliberate architectural spaces. To Zahi Hawass, who served as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities for many years, and who controls more access to Egyptian monuments than perhaps any other single individual, has dismissed underground theories as romantic nonsense promoted by people who know nothing about Egyptology. He has stated repeatedly that there are no significant undiscovered chambers beneath the Sphinx or inside the pyramids. Yet in other contexts he has acknowledged that unexplored passages exist, that chambers remain sealed, that not every corner of Giza has been physically investigated. The contradiction is instructive. Unexplored chambers exist, but exploring them is unnecessary. Passages remain sealed, but there is nothing behind them worth seeing. Anomalies have been detected, but they do not require investigation. The certainty seems disproportionate to the evidence. or rather to the absence of evidence that would come from actually looking. Several explanations have been offered for this institutional resistance. Egypt guards its cultural heritage carefully, and foreign researchers seeking access to monuments are subject to extensive oversight. There are legitimate concerns about tourist disruption, structural damage, and the exploitation of Egyptian history for Western academic careers. There are political sensitivities about who controls the narrative of ancient Egypt and who profits from its presentation. Alternative theories about the pyramids often traffic in speculation that mainstream Egyptologists find offensive, and there may be reluctance to conduct investigations that could be spun by popular media into validation of fringe claims. These are all reasonable concerns, but they do not fully explain why investigation has been prevented even when proposed by credentialed academics using minimally invasive methods with full Egyptian oversight and participation. They do not explain why confirmed anomalies have sat unexplored for decades. They do not explain why the pattern persists across different administrations, different research teams, and different technologies. Another explanation presents itself, one that authorities would never articulate but that the pattern itself suggests. If the official chronology is correct, if the pyramids were built by 4th dynasty pharaohs around 2500 BCE as tombs and nothing more, if the Sphinx was carved by Khafra as a monument to his own reign, if there were no earlier structures and no underground network, then investigation should confirm this. Drilling into the chamber beneath the Sphinx should reveal nothing but empty limestone or perhaps natural geological formation. Sending cameras through the sealed doors in the shafts should reveal construction gaps or abandoned passages. Exploring the void above the Grand Gallery should reveal structural features consistent with known construction techniques. The official narrative should be vindicated. But if the anomalies are what the ancient texts describe, if there are chambers and passages extending beneath the plateau, if they contain artifacts or inscriptions from an era that official chronology does not recognize, then investigation would not confirm the standard narrative. It would upend it. The investment in existing chronology is enormous. Careers have been built on it. Institutions have been organized around it. Textbooks have been written and rewritten to reflect it. The proposition that the pyramids might be younger monuments built atop older foundations is not merely alternative. It is destabilizing. If the underground structures exist and if they date to an era before the 4th dynasty, then virtually everything taught about the origins of Egyptian civilization would require revision. Perhaps that revision is necessary. Perhaps the evidence demands it. Perhaps the ancient texts that describe subterranean halls and chambers and passages connecting Giza to the underworld are not mythology but architecture, not imagination but memory. But if the authorities are not certain, if there is even a chance that investigation might reveal something that cannot be accommodated within the existing framework, then the rational institutional response might be exactly what we observe. Acknowledge the anomalies quietly, dispute them publicly, deny permission indefinitely, and hope that the questions eventually stop being asked. Technology has detected chambers, passages, and voids beneath the Sphinx and inside the pyramids. Multiple independent surveys using different methods have confirmed these anomalies. Ancient texts describe underground complexes in precisely these locations, architectural underworlds matching the geography of Giza. Yet systematic investigation has been prevented for decades. Researchers have been denied, banned, or simply ignored. Results have been disputed without refutation, minimized without explanation, and buried in academic archives where only specialists will ever read them. The sand continues to shift above whatever lies below. The stone continues to press down upon its secrets. And the question is no longer whether something is there. The surveys have answered that. The question is why we are not allowed to look. In the spring of 1999, an excavation team led by Zahi Hawass descended into a shaft that had been known to exist for nearly a century, but had never been systematically explored. A vertical passage cut into the limestone causeway that connects the Sphinx to the Pyramid of Khafra, and what they found there changed the nature of every conversation about what might lie beneath the Giza Plateau. Not because it answered questions, but because it demonstrated beyond dispute that complex underground architecture exists in this place, carved deep into the living rock, extending downward through levels that grow stranger and more suggestive the deeper one goes. The shaft had been noted in surveys dating back to the early 20th century, a rectangular opening in the causeway floor that early explorers had partially cleared before abandoning the effort, leaving it to fill again with sand and debris and the accumulated refuse of decades. But Hawass recognised that this was not merely a pit or a burial shaft of the ordinary kind. This was something that deserved systematic investigation, and so he assembled a team and began the slow process of clearing, documenting and descending into what he would eventually call the Tomb of Osiris, though that name itself carries implications that perhaps reveal more than he intended. The first level lies approximately 30 feet beneath the causeway surface, a rectangular chamber carved from the bedrock with 2 alcoves set into its walls. The space austere and undecorated, stripped of any artifacts that might once have been placed there, or perhaps never finished, never used for whatever purpose its builders originally intended. And at the far end of this chamber, a passage leads to a second vertical shaft, descending further into the darkness, and when the excavators cleared this second shaft and lowered themselves down another 40 feet, they found something markedly different from the empty chamber above. Level 2 opened into a larger space containing 6 small rooms carved into the rock, some of these rooms holding broken sarcophagi, fragments of pottery scattered across the floors, evidence of ancient use, though the exact nature of that use remained ambiguous. And here the construction style shifted notably from the level above, the carving cruder, less precise, the walls rougher, as though this level had been cut by different hands or in a different era. And some observers noted that cruder often means older in archaeological contexts, that techniques tend to refine rather than degrade over time, which raised questions about whether level 2 might predate level 1 rather than following it in a simple downward sequence. But it was level 3 that captured attention and has continued to generate discussion in the years since, because from level 2, another shaft descends even deeper. And when the excavators finally cleared this passage and dropped down into the chamber below, they found themselves standing approximately 100 feet beneath the surface of the Giza Plateau, in a space that seemed designed to embody something the ancient texts had been describing all along. The chamber at level 3 contains a massive sarcophagus carved from black granite, polished smooth, precisely cut, resting on a raised platform in the centre of the room, and the platform is surrounded by water. Not stagnant water collected from seepage over centuries, but living water, constantly replenished from the aquifer that runs beneath the Giza bedrock. So that the sarcophagus appears to float on a subterranean pool, isolated by water on all sides, exactly as the pyramid texts describe the resting place of the dead king, exactly as Herodotus described the tomb of Cheops in his account written 25 centuries ago, a chamber surrounded by water brought from the river through underground channels. The engineering implications of this sarcophagus deserve careful consideration, because the granite coffin is too large to have been lowered down through the narrow shafts connecting the levels above. The passages are simply too tight, the angles too acute. There is no way to maneuver an object of this size down through the route the excavators themselves had used, which means the sarcophagus was not installed after the upper levels were complete. It was placed in position first before the shaft system was finished, before the upper chambers were carved, before the causeway above was constructed, and the entire structure was then built upward from this deepest point. The levels added in sequence rising toward the surface, the passages carved to connect what had been established below to what was being created above. This construction sequence tells us something important about intention and planning, because you do not carve 100 feet down through bedrock, install a granite sarcophagus at the water table, and then build upward in 3 distinct phases unless you know from the beginning what you are building and why, unless the deepest level is not an afterthought but the purpose, the destination toward which everything else points, and the upper levels serve as access points, way stations, perhaps ritual chambers where preparations were made before the final descent into the flooded chamber below. Hawass interpreted the structure as a symbolic tomb of Osiris, a cenotaph built by 26th dynasty priests around 664 to 525 BCE to create a physical connection between the Giza Plateau and the mythological underworld, a place where rituals could be performed honouring the god of death and resurrection, and this interpretation fits comfortably within conventional Egyptological frameworks. It explains the structure without requiring any revision of accepted chronology. It makes the Osiris Shaft a late-period religious construction, rather than evidence of something older, and scholars have generally accepted this dating and interpretation without significant challenge. But the interpretation raises questions it does not answer, beginning with the most obvious one. Why would 26th dynasty priests carve 100 feet into the bedrock through the water table to install a granite sarcophagus in a flooded chamber, when they could have built a symbolic tomb anywhere on the plateau with far less effort? What was it about this specific location, this specific depth, that required such extraordinary engineering, And if the structure is purely symbolic, why build it in a place where the water table makes it perpetually inaccessible, perpetually difficult to maintain, perpetually hidden from the very worshippers it was supposedly built to serve? And then there are the passages, the ones Hawass mentioned in his reports but did not pursue. Tunnels leading away from the Osiris Shaft in multiple directions, some appearing to head toward the Sphinx, others toward the Great Pyramid, blocked with debris, he said, inaccessible, unexplored, noted in the documentation and then left for future investigators who have not yet investigated them. These passages raise the most significant question the Osiris Shaft poses, because if tunnels extend from this location toward other monuments on the plateau, if the shaft is connected to a larger underground network rather than standing as an isolated structure, then its meaning changes entirely. It becomes not a destination but a junction, not a symbolic tomb but an access point, one node in a system that might extend far beyond what has been excavated, far beyond what current archaeology has been willing to consider. The water table itself deserves attention because level 3 sits precisely at the aquifer level, the point where groundwater saturates the bedrock. And this was not accidental. The builders knew what depth they were aiming for. They planned to reach the water, to create a chamber that would be perpetually flooded. And if passages extend from this flooded level toward the Sphinx and the pyramids, those passages too would be at least partially submerged, which explains why they remain unexplored, but does not explain why exploration has not been attempted with the waterproof equipment and pumping technology available to modern archaeology. The texts we have examined in earlier portions of this account describe the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. In architectural terms, they describe chambers and passages and waterways, gates that must be passed and guardians that must be named. And they specifically identify the region around the Sphinx, the area called Rostau, as the entrance to this underworld realm. And here, beneath the causeway connecting the Sphinx to the second pyramid, we find exactly what the texts describe: a descent through levels into a flooded chamber, passages extending outward toward the monuments the texts identify as marking the entrance. If the Osiris Shaft dates to the 26th dynasty, then late-period priests chose this location for reasons they considered sufficient. But those reasons might not have been purely symbolic. They might have known that something existed here, something they were accessing or commemorating or attempting to connect with. And their construction might have been not creation but restoration, not invention but inheritance, rebuilding a connection to something they believed had been established in the distant past, in the time of the gods, in the era before the monuments we see today were erected. The technical achievement the shaft represents should not be underestimated regardless of its age. Carving through 100 feet of bedrock with hand tools, managing water infiltration during construction, installing a granite sarcophagus at the deepest level before building the access system above it. These are not trivial accomplishments. They required sophisticated engineering knowledge, careful planning, and the organizational capacity to sustain a complex project over extended time. And if the ancient Egyptians could do this in one location, they could do it in others. The Osiris Shaft proves capability, even if it does not prove extent. And the extent remains unknown because the passages have not been followed, the connections have not been mapped, the questions the shaft raises have been answered with interpretations rather than investigations. And perhaps those interpretations are correct. Perhaps the shaft is exactly what Hawass says it is, a late-period symbolic tomb. Perhaps the passages are short dead ends leading nowhere significant. Perhaps the flooded chamber contains nothing but the granite sarcophagus visible to excavators, but we do not know this. We assume it. We interpret the evidence to fit existing frameworks rather than exploring whether those frameworks might need revision. The Osiris Shaft sits beneath the causeway like a vertical cross-section of the plateau itself, 3 levels descending through the bedrock into water, passages extending outward toward monuments, a massive granite coffin resting on an island surrounded by the living aquifer, and whether we interpret this structure as late-period construction or evidence of something older, it proves one thing beyond dispute: that complex underground architecture exists beneath Giza, that the ancient Egyptians, at whatever date, possessed the technical abilities to carve deep into the earth and construct elaborate chambers below the water table, that passages were cut connecting underground spaces to surface monuments, and that much of what was built remains unexplored, acknowledged in excavation reports but never followed, documented and then abandoned, waiting in the flooded darkness beneath the plateau for investigators willing to descend. The question the Osiris Shaft poses is not whether underground structures exist at Giza. The shaft itself answers that. The question is how far they extend, whether the passages noted by Hawass connect to other passages, whether those connect to chambers described in texts but never excavated, whether the network the ancient sources describe, the labyrinth Herodotus visited. The underground realm the pyramid texts map in such detail might actually exist, flooded now, blocked with debris but structurally intact, waiting beneath a tourist site visited by millions who walk above it without knowing what they walk above. If the Osiris Shaft is a destination, an isolated structure built for symbolic purposes and connected to nothing beyond itself, then it tells us only that late-period priests had interesting ideas about connecting Giza to the underworld. But if the Osiris Shaft is an entrance, one access point among several leading into a larger underground complex, then everything we think we know about this place, about what it was built for, about what it contains, about how old its deepest structures might be, all of that remains not wrong but incomplete, not answered but unasked, not solved but waiting. 100 feet down, where the water rises and the passages lead outward into darkness, toward the Sphinx crouching above, toward the pyramid rising against the desert sky, toward whatever the ancients believed was important enough to bury this deep and guard this carefully, and describe in texts that have survived 5,000 years of silence. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, an Egyptian priest named Manetho undertook a task that would shape our understanding of ancient history for the next 2,000 years. He was serving at the Temple of Heliopolis during the reign of Ptolemy II, a Greek king ruling Egypt who wanted to understand the civilization his dynasty had inherited. Manetho wrote in Greek, making Egyptian history accessible to the wider Mediterranean world, and his work organized the pharaohs into 30 dynasties stretching from the unification of Egypt under Menes around 3100 BC through to the conquest by Alexander the Great. His original text has been lost to time, but excerpts survive in the writings of later historians, including Josephus, Africanus, and Eusebius, and where his chronology can be verified against archaeological evidence and surviving Egyptian records, Manetho has proven remarkably accurate. The names he lists correspond to names found on temple walls and tomb inscriptions. The reign lengths he provides align with what independent sources suggest. The sequence of dynasties he established remains the framework within which Egyptologists organize their understanding of Egyptian history. But here is what modern summaries of Manetho consistently omit. His chronology did not begin with the first dynasty. Before Menes, before the unification, before what we consider the beginning of Egyptian history, Manetho described an earlier era, and he described it with the same matter-of-fact precision he applied to the pharaohs whose existence archaeology has confirmed. According to the excerpts preserved by later writers, Manetho divided the pre-dynastic period into 3 successive phases. First came the reign of the gods themselves, beings he named and listed individually, including Ptah, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, and Horus. These were not described as mythological figures inhabiting some spiritual realm. They were described as rulers who governed Egypt in sequence, one succeeding another, each with a specified reign length. After the gods came the demigods, figures of intermediate status who bridged the divine and human eras. And after the demigods came the spirits of the dead, sometimes translated as the followers of Horus, who governed for an extended period before human kings finally assumed the throne. The total duration of this pre-dynastic era, according to the figures Manetho provided, exceeded 24,000 years. Some calculations derived from the surviving excerpts suggest even longer, with certain versions extending the divine reigns across tens of thousands of years. Modern scholarship categorizes this pre-dynastic chronology as mythology pure and simple. The reign lengths are considered impossible, the rulers are identified with gods from the Egyptian pantheon, and the entire section is treated as religious narrative that Manetho included to satisfy the expectations of his priestly audience. Historians extract his dynastic list while discarding the preceding section as though it were an embarrassing appendix, a lapse in otherwise rigorous historical method. But Manetho himself made no such distinction. His text moved from the pre-dynastic period into the first dynasty without any shift in tone, without any disclaimer suggesting that one section was historical and another mythological, without any indication that he understood himself to be mixing 2 fundamentally different kinds of material. He was copying from temple archives, translating from hieratic and hieroglyphic sources into Greek, and those archives apparently treated the entire chronology as continuous historical record. And Manetho was not the only source preserving this extended timeline. The Palermo stone, now held in the Palermo Archaeological Museum in Sicily, is one of the oldest surviving Egyptian royal annals. It dates to the 5th dynasty, roughly 2400 BCE, nearly 2000 years before Manetho compiled his history. The stone is a fragment of a larger slab, originally inscribed on both sides with a year-by-year record of Egyptian kings and their accomplishments. The surviving portions cover the first 5 dynasties in varying detail, listing kings, recording Nile flood levels, noting religious festivals, and documenting building projects. But the Palermo stone does not begin with the 1st dynasty. It begins earlier. The top register of the stone contains a row of names that precede Menes, names that Egyptologists have struggled to identify or categorize. These pre-dynastic entries include figures depicted wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, the same regalia worn by later pharaohs. They are not distinguished from the dynastic kings by any different type of iconography or notation. They simply appear earlier in the sequence, treated by the scribes who carved the stone as rulers who preceded the unification but governed nonetheless. The names are partially damaged, the reign lengths are fragmentary, and scholarly interpretation has varied widely regarding what these entries represent. Some suggest they are mythological personages, others propose they represent pre-unification rulers of Upper Egypt alone, and still others argue they may preserve memory of an earlier phase of Egyptian political organization that left no other trace. What remains undeniable is that the scribes of the 5th dynasty, writing 1,000 years before Manetho, already maintained records extending Egyptian kingship beyond the boundary modern archaeology considers the beginning of history. They were not inventing these figures. They were copying from older sources, maintaining continuity with archives they believed to be accurate, transmitting a chronology they treated as factual. The Turin Royal Canon tells a similar story. This papyrus, now in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, dates to the reign of Ramesses II in the 19th dynasty, approximately 1250 BCE. It was discovered in the early 19th century and unfortunately suffered severe damage during transport, breaking into numerous fragments that scholars have spent 2 centuries attempting to reassemble. When complete, it would have listed every king of Egypt in chronological order, with reign lengths precise to the year, month, and day. It was an official document maintained by temple scribes used for administrative and ritual purposes. The surviving portions of the Turin Canon confirm its accuracy for the dynastic period, matching archaeological evidence and other sources with impressive precision. But like Manetho, and like the Palermo stone, the Turin Canon did not begin with the 1st dynasty. The papyrus included entries for rulers before Menes, figures the text describes as the followers of Horus, the Shemsu-Hor, and it included reign length totals for periods before even the Shemsu-Hor, periods when divine beings were said to have governed Egypt. The total timeline implied by the Turin Canon, reconstructed from fragmentary summation entries, extended Egyptian civilization back tens of thousands of years before the conventionally accepted date for the 1st dynasty. One damaged section appears to record a total reign duration of over 23,000 years for the gods alone. Another section suggests the Shemsu-Hor governed for approximately 13 to 400 years before human pharaohs took the throne. These numbers are extraordinary. They are also official. The Turin Canon was not a mythological text, not a religious poem, not a work of speculative theology. It was a bureaucratic document listing kings and reign lengths for administrative purposes. Its compilers were not embellishing for poetic effect. They were recording what they understood to be historical fact. The consistency between these independent sources deserves attention. Manetho writing in the 3rd century BCE, the Turin Canon from the 13th century BCE, and the Palermo stone from the 24th century BCE all describe Egyptian civilization extending back to an era before the 1st dynasty. They all include reign lengths that modern scholarship considers impossible. They all treat this extended chronology with the same documentary precision they apply to verifiable historical periods. Across more than 2,000 years of the Egyptian record-keeping, the belief that civilization stretched back into deep prehistory remained stable, maintained by temple archives recorded on official monuments, copied by scribes who understood themselves to be preserving accurate historical tradition. What did the priests actually believe? Herodotus provides a glimpse. When he visited Egypt around 450 BCE, He was granted access to temple archives and taken through priestly collections. He describes priests reading to him from written records, showing him lists of kings, explaining the succession of rulers across what they claimed was more than 11,000 years of continuous civilization. The priests distinguished between periods when gods ruled and periods when humans ruled, but they did not treat the divine period as mythology. They treated it as history, the earliest chapter of a story that continued into their present. They could point to specific monuments and say these were built during the time of the gods. They could identify specific rituals and say these were established during the first time. Their institutional memory was not vague legend, but organised archive, written record maintained across millennia precisely because they believed it was true. The concept of Zep Tepi appears repeatedly in Egyptian religious and historical texts. Usually translated as the first time, Zep Tepi referred to the era when the world was first organised, when divine beings established the patterns that civilization would follow, when the temples were first founded, the rituals first performed, the sacred sites first consecrated. Modern Egyptology treats Zep Tepi as a mythological concept, part of Egyptian cosmological belief, rather than historical memory. But the Egyptians themselves used the term in historical contexts, dating monuments and institutions to the first time, claiming that what existed in their present was a continuation or restoration of what had been established then. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu during the Ptolemaic period, describe the founding of the temple in terms that connect it to Zep Tepi. They speak of sages who came to Egypt after a catastrophic flood, who rebuilt civilization according to the patterns preserved from the first time, who established the sacred mounds that would become the sites of Egyptian temples. The texts describe these sages not as gods, but as beings who possessed divine knowledge, intermediary figures who transmitted what had been learned in an earlier age to the humans who would carry it forward. And the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, appear throughout Egyptian texts as precisely this kind of intermediary. They are credited with building the monuments that the 4th dynasty allegedly constructed. They are credited with establishing the rituals that the priesthood maintained. They are credited with knowledge that was already ancient when the 1st dynasty began. They were associated specifically with the horizon, the region we call Giza, where the Sphinx faces east toward the rising sun and the pyramids stand as the most enduring monuments of ancient civilization. Who were the Shemsu Hor? The question has no settled answer. Some scholars interpret them as legendary ancestors, mythologized memories of pre-dynastic chieftains whose historical reality has been lost. Others see them as purely symbolic, representing the transmission of royal power through spiritual succession rather than biological descent. Still others have proposed that the Shemsu Hor represent an actual elite, a ruling class or priestly caste, whose existence preceded the 1st dynasty, and whose knowledge formed the foundation upon which dynastic Egypt was built. If the Shemsu Hor were an actual group, if they ruled during the extended period the Egyptian sources describe, if they built monuments at Giza before the 4th dynasty arrived, then the underground chambers detected beneath the Sphinx and the pyramids take on new significance. They would not be constructions of the 4th dynasty at all. They would be constructions of the first time, built by the beings Egyptian tradition credited with establishing civilization itself, preserved beneath the surface while the pyramids rose above as markers, monuments, or seals. The 4th dynasty on this reading did not create the sacred precinct at Giza. They inherited it. They built their pyramids on ground already consecrated, above structures already ancient, according to plans already established. Khufu did not design the layout. He followed it. Khafra did not choose the site. It had been chosen thousands of years before. The Sphinx that faces east may not have been carved during the 4th dynasty at all. It may have been there when they arrived, already watching the horizon, already guarding whatever lies beneath. Modern scholarship rejects this interpretation for understandable reasons. There is no archaeological evidence of advanced civilization in Egypt before approximately 3100 BCE. The reign lengths described in the ancient sources are biologically impossible. The textual tradition is assumed to conflate mythology with history, mixing religious belief with administrative record. The extended chronology is considered exaggeration, symbolic inflation, or misunderstanding by later compilers who did not grasp that their sources were speaking metaphorically. But this rejection requires assuming that the Egyptian priests were either mistaken about their own tradition or deliberately deceptive. It requires assuming that temple archives maintained for thousands of years somehow confused mythology with history in ways that modern scholars can detect but ancient scribes could not. It requires assuming that the same record-keeping system that accurately preserved the names and reign lengths of dynastic pharaohs somehow failed catastrophically when recording earlier periods. And it requires assuming that no investigation of the underground chambers at Giza could possibly reveal anything that would support the extended chronology. This assumption has never been tested. The underground passages detected beneath the Sphinx have not been excavated. The cavities identified by ground-penetrating radar have not been explored. The passages leading from the Osiris Shaft have not been followed. The official position is that nothing of significance remains to be discovered, but that position rests not on evidence from thorough investigation, but on the assumption that the ancient sources must be wrong. The Egyptian priests maintained this extended chronology as historical fact. They recorded it on official monuments, preserved it in temple archives, transmitted it across millennia with remarkable consistency. They believed that civilization at Giza stretched back to the first time, that the monuments there were established by divine or semi-divine beings, that the sacred precinct was not created by the 4th dynasty but inherited by them. They believed, in other words, that something was there before the pyramids. And if they were right, then the question of what lies beneath the Giza Plateau is not merely archaeological. It is a question about the entire timeline of human civilization, about whether history begins where we think it does, about whether the monuments we consider ancient were themselves built above something far more ancient still. The priests are gone now, their temples in ruins, their archives scattered and lost, but their records survive in fragments, in damaged papyri and broken stones, in excerpts quoted by later writers, in inscriptions still visible on temple walls. Those records describe a chronology that modern scholarship has decided must be wrong. But the priests believed they were right. They maintained their records with care precisely because accuracy mattered, because the timeline they preserved connected their present to a past they considered sacred, because forgetting would mean losing something essential about who they were and where they had come from. If the underground chambers at Giza contain evidence that supports the extended chronology, evidence of construction before the 4th dynasty, evidence of knowledge that predates what archaeology considers the beginning of Egyptian civilization, then the priests would be vindicated. Their records would be not mythology but memory, not exaggeration but testimony, not confusion but precision about an era we have only begun to imagine. And if they were right about the chronology, then perhaps they were right about what lies beneath. In the southern reaches of Egypt, where the Nile flows through landscapes that have changed little since the pharaoh's rule, there stands a temple dedicated to Horus that most tourists pass through, quickly photographing the falcon statues and the massive pylon gates before moving on to sites they consider more significant. But the walls of Edfu contain something that careful scholars have studied for over a century without fully reckoning with its implications. Inscribed in hieroglyphics covering thousands of square feet of interior surface are texts that describe not merely the rituals performed within the temple, but the history of how such temples came to exist at all. These are the building texts of Edfu, and they tell a story that does not fit comfortably within conventional chronology. The texts describe a time before the current age of Egypt when a catastrophe destroyed an earlier world. They describe waters rising and lands being submerged. They describe a primeval island that survived the destruction, becoming the first dry land to emerge when the waters receded. And they describe 7 beings they call the Shebtu, or builder gods, who arrived in Egypt after this catastrophe with a specific mission. They came to recreate the former world. The language of the Edfu text is precise in ways that make dismissal difficult. The Shebtu did not create civilization from nothing. They did not invent the principles of sacred architecture. They rebuilt according to patterns that had existed before the destruction. They established sacred sites upon foundations that the texts explicitly state predated their own arrival. The primeval mound they consecrated was not a new creation, but a rediscovery of something that had survived. The temples they founded were not original designs, but reconstructions of structures that had been destroyed. The knowledge they transmitted had been preserved through the catastrophe by means the texts do not fully explain. Egyptologists have studied the Edfu texts extensively, producing translations and commentaries that fill academic volumes. But the implications of what the texts actually say have been carefully contained within scholarly frameworks that prevent those implications from disrupting established chronology. The 7 sages are interpreted as mythological rather than historical. The catastrophe is read as symbolic rather than actual. The foundations predating the builders are understood as theological concepts rather than physical structures. This interpretive approach allows the text to exist within academic discourse, without requiring any revision of the timeline that places Egyptian civilization beginning around 3100 BCE, with no significant predecessor. But the Edfu texts do not stand alone. Across the ancient Near East, in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia preserved in museums from London to Baghdad, the same patterns appears in texts that predate any possible Egyptian influence on Sumerian culture. The Sumerians described kingship descending from heaven in times before a great flood. They maintained lists of rulers who governed for impossibly long periods before the deluge and much shorter periods afterward. They described the Anunnaki as beings who brought civilization to humanity, and they placed the source of the Anunnaki's wisdom in an underground realm they called the Absu. This was the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and it was located specifically beneath the surface of the earth, beneath the waters that flow above ground. The Absu was not merely a mythological concept, but a place with described characteristics, a subterranean realm where knowledge was preserved and from which it could be accessed by those with proper training and authorization. The parallels between Egyptian and Mesopotamian tradition could perhaps be explained by cultural contact. Trade routes connected these civilizations and ideas could have travelled along with goods, but the same pattern appears in traditions that had no documented contact with the ancient Near East in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, from the temple scribes of Edfu and Eridu. In the Indian subcontinent, traditions preserved in Sanskrit texts describe beings called Nagas who dwell in underground cities of remarkable sophistication. The Nagas are depicted as serpent beings or as humans with serpentine attributes, and Western interpreters have typically read them as purely mythological creatures representing fierce natural phenomena. But the texts themselves describe the Nagas with architectural specificity that sits uncomfortably with purely symbolic interpretation. Their underground realm, called Patala or Nagaloka, contains palaces constructed with precious stones and metals. It contains streets and public spaces. It contains gardens that flourish without sunlight through means the texts do not explain. The descriptions present not a vague underworld, but a complete underground civilization with infrastructure and social organization. The Nagas are not enemies of surface dwellers in these traditions. They are guardians. They possess advanced knowledge that they protect from those who are not ready to receive it. Certain human sages in Indian tradition are described as having gained access to Naga wisdom through initiation, and those sages returned to the surface world with knowledge that elevated their understanding beyond their contemporaries. The underground realm is a repository of preserved wisdom accessible only to initiates guarded not to prevent access entirely, but to ensure that access is granted only to those who have prepared themselves to receive what is stored below. The pattern repeats across the Pacific Ocean in traditions that developed without any contact with Old World civilizations. The Hopi people of the American Southwest maintain oral traditions describing the origin of humanity that center on emergence from underground. In Hopi cosmology, the current world is the fourth world, and the previous three worlds each ended in catastrophic destruction. Survivors of each catastrophe were preserved underground and led through passages to emerge into the next world when the surface became habitable again. The underground realm in Hopi tradition is not a metaphor for spiritual transformation. It is described as an actual place where ancestors lived before climbing upward through a passage called the Sipapu to reach the surface of the current world. The Hopi describe this emergence with geographical specificity, claiming that the Sipapu through which their ancestors emerged can still be located. They describe the underground realm as having social organization, leadership, and physical characteristics that parallel surface existence. The pattern of catastrophe, underground preservation, and emergence to rebuild civilization on the surface matches what appears in Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts. Yet the Hopi developed this tradition in complete isolation from Old World influence. Either human psychology universally generates the same detailed mythology about underground realms and post-catastrophe emergence, or something happened in the human past that multiple cultures independently remember. Across the ocean in China, traditions describe cave systems that function as entrances to underground realms inhabited by dragons. The dragon in Chinese culture is not the destructive beast of European mythology, but a creature associated with wisdom water and the preservation of sacred knowledge. Certain caves throughout China were considered holy sites precisely because they were understood as passages to deeper realms where knowledge was stored. The treasures guarded by dragons in Chinese tradition were not merely gold and jewels, but wisdom and understanding. The caves containing these treasures were not random geological formations, but selected sites where access to the underground realm was possible. Again, the pattern appears. Underground spaces preserve knowledge from before the current age, and that knowledge is guarded by serpentine or draconic beings who permit access only under specific conditions. The serpent or dragon as guardian of underground wisdom appears in traditions spanning the globe. The Nagas of India. The dragons of China, the Shebtiu, depicted with serpentine characteristics in some Edfu representations, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerican tradition, who brought knowledge and civilization to humanity. The consistency of this imagery across cultures that had no means of influencing each other demands explanation. Perhaps the serpent represents something universal in human psychology. Perhaps underground darkness evokes similar fears and similar hopes in all human minds, leading to similar mythological expressions. This psychological explanation has satisfied most academic interpreters, allowing the patterns to be acknowledged without requiring investigation of whether something physical corresponds to the myths. But the psychological explanation struggles to account for the architectural specificity that appears across these traditions. If underground realms are purely symbolic, why do the descriptions include details about construction materials, room arrangements, and infrastructure? If the serpent guardians are merely projections of human fear, why are they consistently described as protectors of wisdom rather than threats to human safety? If post-catastrophe emergence is a universal metaphor for spiritual rebirth, why do so many traditions describe it with geographical precision, naming locations and describing passages that can theoretically be verified? The alternative explanation is uncomfortable for modern scholarship because it requires acknowledging possibilities that academic disciplines have spent centuries excluding from serious consideration. The alternative is that something happened in human prehistory that multiple cultures remember. Catastrophe of sufficient magnitude to appear in traditions around the world, a period of preservation during which survivors and their knowledge were protected underground. An emergence afterward, during which preserved knowledge was used to rebuild civilization on the surface. Here, the underground realms described in myth would then be physical spaces where that preservation occurred, and the guardian, serpentine or otherwise, would be either the keepers of those spaces or symbolic representations of the institutions that controlled access to them. Under this interpretation, Giza would be one site among many, but possibly the most significant. The Edfu texts describe Egypt as the location of the primeval mound, the first land to emerge after the waters receded. The Sphinx sits in a deliberately carved trench with documented passages leading downward. The pyramids, according to Herodotus, were built over underground chambers that contained the actual burial sites of their builders. The Hall of Records predicted by Case and investigated by modern researchers would be not an anomaly, but one example of a pattern that appears globally. Other sites would contain similar repositories. The caves of the Hopi would preserve whatever their ancestors brought through the Sipapu. The Naga cities of Indian tradition would exist beneath the subcontinent. The dragon caves of China would open into realms that are not merely symbolic. The academic implications of this possibility explain much of the resistance to investigating it seriously. The chronology of human civilization as currently understood places the emergence of complex society around 6,000 years ago, with the development of writing agriculture and monumental architecture occurring independently in several locations as human populations reached sufficient density to support these innovations. Everything before this period is prehistory characterized by small-scale societies without writing, without cities, without the accumulated knowledge that defines civilization. If underground repositories existed containing evidence of sophisticated achievement before this conventionally accepted timeline, then the entire framework within which archaeology and ancient history operate would require fundamental revision. The investment in the current chronology is enormous. Careers have been built upon it. Institutions have organized themselves around it. Museums have arranged their collections according to it. Textbooks have taught generations of students to understand the human past through its lens. Evidence that contradicts this framework is not merely inconvenient, but threatening to the professional identities of those who have spent their lives working within it. Resistance to such evidence is understandable even if not justifiable. civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, describe the same pattern with the same essential details. Knowledge preserved underground, accessible only to initiates guarded by serpentine beings containing the wisdom of an era before catastrophe. The surface world in these traditions is not the origin of civilization, but its inheritor rebuilding from what was preserved below when earlier achievements were destroyed. If this is universal psychology, it is remarkably consistent in its specifics, generating the same architectural details, the same guardian imagery, the same narrative of destruction, preservation, and emergence in cultures that had no means of influencing each other. If this is cultural memory, it preserves something that most historians have refused to consider: that human civilization is older than we acknowledge, that its earliest achievements survived catastrophe in protected locations, that those locations may still exist containing evidence that would transform our understanding of who we are and how we came to build the world we inhabit. The texts that describe these underground realms have been translated, studied, and published. They sit in libraries and museums available to anyone willing to read them without the interpretive filters that transform their specific claims into comfortable metaphors. The question is not whether the traditions exist. The question is whether we are willing to follow them to their conclusions, to investigate whether the underground repositories they describe with such architectural precision might actually be there waiting beneath surfaces we have assumed hold nothing of significance. The evidence accumulates like sand in an hourglass, grain by grain across millennia, each source adding weight to a pattern that becomes difficult to dismiss through any single objection. Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and described underground chambers beneath the pyramids, a labyrinth containing 1,500 subterranean rooms, and priests who maintained institutional memory of what lay beneath. Strabo arrived 4 centuries later and confirmed the same traditions, describing passages that wind through darkness connecting chambers that visitors were forbidden to enter. The pyramid texts carved into royal tombs beginning around 2350 BCE describe the underworld with architectural precision, specifying corridors and chambers and gates and guardians, naming the Giza Plateau as Rostau, the entrance to the Duat, the realm beneath. The inventory stela, whatever its date of composition, preserves a tradition that the Sphinx and its associated temple existed before Khufu built his pyramid, suggesting that the 4th dynasty pharaohs arrived at a site already sacred, already developed, already concealing something beneath its sand. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure suggest weathering from rainfall that ceased to fall in the Sahara thousands of years before conventional chronology allows, pushing the monument's origin back into an era we call prehistoric, only because we have chosen not to count it as history. The Turin King List and the Palermo Stone, the Egyptians' own records of their own past, extend civilization back tens of thousands of years before Nama unified the two lands, describing divine dynasties and semi-divine rulers whose reigns conventional scholarship dismisses as mythology rather than memory. And beneath the plateau itself, the Osiris Shaft descends through multiple levels carved into bedrock, containing a sarcophagus surrounded by water at a depth of nearly 100 feet, connected to passages that have never been fully explored, never been adequately explained, never been integrated into any coherent understanding of what the builders intended. The shafts in the Queen's chamber terminate at stone doors with copper fittings, and what lies behind those doors remains publicly unknown. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have detected cavities and anomalies throughout the plateau. Voids that may be natural, may be artificial, may be connected, may lead somewhere, may contain something, or maybe nothing at all. The conventional response to all of this evidence is dismissal, but the dismissals do not quite cohere. The ancient texts are mythology, we are told, except when they describe monuments we can still see, in which case they are reliable historical sources. The technological surveys are measurement errors, except when they confirm expected findings, in which case they are valid scientific evidence. The Osiris Shaft is symbolic, a ritual space not connected to anything larger, except that no one has followed its passages to their termination to confirm they lead nowhere. The pre-dynastic chronology is a fabrication, priestly exaggeration, numbers that should not be taken literally, except that the Egyptians themselves carved these numbers into stone and maintained them for centuries as their official history. The erosion evidence is controversial, we are told, which is accurate, but controversy is not refutation, and the geologists who have examined the Sphinx enclosure continue to observe weathering patterns inconsistent with the accepted timeline. The resistance to investigation appears disproportionate to the claimed certainty that nothing significant remains to be found. For if the underground spaces contain nothing, exploration would confirm this conclusion and silence the speculation permanently, while continued refusal to investigate allows questions to proliferate in the absence of answers. Consider for a moment the implications if the ancient accounts were accurate, if beneath the Giza Plateau there exist chambers and passages constructed before the 4th dynasty, containing artifacts and inscriptions from an era we do not include in our history books. This would not require invoking lost continents or alien intervention or any of the sensational narratives that have attached themselves to questions about ancient Egypt, for the Egyptians themselves claimed to be inheritors rather than inventors, custodians of knowledge passed down from earlier ages, maintainers of traditions whose origins they trace to the first time when the gods walked the earth and established the patterns that humans would follow. If they were correct, even partially, even in outline rather than detail, then the 4th dynasty pharaohs did not create Egyptian civilization from nothing. They continued something already ancient, already sophisticated, already established on a foundation whose origins extended back beyond their own records, back into an era when the Sahara was green and water flowed through channels that are now buried beneath sand. The pyramids would represent not the beginning of monumental civilization, but a late flourishing of traditions whose roots penetrated far deeper into time than we have been willing to imagine. The precision of their construction, the sophistication of their engineering, the complexity of their symbolism would make more sense as the culmination of the millennia of development, rather than the sudden invention of a people who had been subsistence farmers a few centuries before. The presence of underground chambers and passages would represent not anomaly but continuity, the preservation of sacred spaces that predated the surface monuments, the maintenance of access to something the later dynasties considered too important to abandon, too dangerous to expose, too precious to destroy. The implications extend beyond Egypt, for if one civilization maintained knowledge from deep prehistory, others may have done the same, and the cross-cultural traditions of underground sacred spaces, subterranean repositories of wisdom, and forbidden chambers containing the preserved remains of ancient teachers would take on new significance. The mystery traditions of Greece and Rome, the underground temples of Anatolia, the cave complexes of India and China, the cenotes of Mesoamerica, the subterranean chambers reported beneath sites throughout the ancient world might represent not independent inventions but connected traditions, fragments of a network that once linked sacred sites across continents, maintaining in darkness what could not survive on the surface. This is speculation, of course extrapolation from limited evidence, connection of dots that may not actually connect, but the dots exist, the traditions exist, the underground spaces exist, and the questions persist precisely because they have not been adequately answered. The history of human civilization as currently taught describes a pattern of independent development, isolated communities discovering agriculture and metallurgy, and writing and architecture on their own, gradually building complex societies from simple beginnings, ascending from savagery to civilization through their own unaided efforts. This narrative has served purposes beyond scholarship, justifying certain hierarchies, certain assumptions about progress, certain claims about the uniqueness of modern achievement. If that narrative required revision, if humans were not inventors but inheritors, not creators but custodians, not self-made but dependent on knowledge, passed down from ages we have forgotten, then our understanding of ourselves would shift in ways difficult to predict. For we would no longer be the pinnacle of a process we initiated, but the latest phase of a cycle whose origins we cannot trace and whose extent we cannot measure. Why does this matter beyond academic curiosity, beyond the satisfaction of solving historical puzzles, beyond the pleasure of exploring forbidden places and discovering hidden things? It matters because how we understand our past shapes how we understand ourselves, shapes what we believe possible, shapes what we consider worth preserving and what we consider expendable. If civilization is a recent invention, fragile and hard-won, then we are self-created beings, responsible for everything we have achieved, entitled to modify or discard what previous generations built because we are simply the latest and presumably best iteration of the human project. If civilization is an inheritance from a forgotten era, knowledge preserved across catastrophe and passed down through chain of custody we can no longer trace, then we are stewards of something larger than ourselves, obligated to preserve what we have received, cautious about discarding what we may not be able to recreate, humble in the face of achievements we have not matched and may never surpass. The question of what lies beneath Giza is ultimately a question about who we are, where we came from, and what responsibilities we carry toward the future. The pyramids stand today as the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, photographed by millions of tourists, studied by thousands of scholars, visible from space, familiar to anyone who has seen a documentary or opened a history book. They are perhaps the most examined structures on Earth, measured with lasers, scanned with satellites, analysed with every technology modern science has developed. And yet the ground beneath them remains largely unexplored. The passages that descend into bedrock have not been followed to their termination. The voids that technology has detected have not been excavated. The shafts that end at sealed doors have not been opened. The Osiris complex sits flooded and unexplored below the causeway. The texts describing what lies beneath remain largely unread outside specialist circles, and the questions those texts raise remain largely unasked in mainstream discourse. Perhaps there is nothing to find. Perhaps the passages end in rubble, the chambers are empty, the doors open onto bare stone, the surveys detected nothing but natural voids, and the texts describe nothing but imagination. Perhaps we already know everything Giza has to teach, and further investigation would simply confirm what the experts have maintained for a century, that the 4th dynasty built everything we see, left nothing important underground, inherited nothing significant from earlier ages, and invented Egyptian civilization from nothing in a few remarkable centuries of creative explosion. Perhaps, or perhaps beneath the sand and stone something waits. The ancient Egyptians built monuments intended to last forever, aligned to stars, proportioned according to mathematics, constructed with precision modern engineers struggle to match. They wrote texts describing underground realms of preserved knowledge, sacred spaces beneath the earth where the gods dwelt and where the dead were transformed. They maintained chronologies extending back tens of thousands of years, recording dynasties of rulers who reigned before the flood, before the great catastrophe, before the current cycle of human history began. They believed they were custodians of something older than themselves, inheritors of wisdom from the first time, maintainers of traditions they did not invent but received. And then they too became history, their language forgotten for centuries, their monuments buried under sand, their texts unreadable until a chance discovery on a Napoleonic campaign and a brilliant linguist's dedication unlocked the hieroglyphs and gave us back their words. What else remains locked? Waiting for the right discovery, the right dedication, the right question, asked by someone willing to descend the steps and pass through the gates and look in the places we have agreed not to look. If the ancients were right, if beneath the plateau that holds the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, there lie chambers and passages, and preserved knowledge from an era before the pyramids were even imagined, then we are not seekers of a hidden past. We are already standing on top of it. The stones beneath our feet, the sand shifting in the wind, the bedrock extending down into darkness. All of it contains whatever it contains, has contained it for millennia, will continue to contain it whether we investigate or not. The only question is whether we will ever descend those steps, pass through those gates, and discover what our oldest ancestors believed was too important to leave on the surface, too sacred to expose to the sky, and too precious or too dangerous to them to be forgotten. And perhaps that is why as you drift towards sleep, the sand still shifts in the desert wind, covering what it covers, revealing what it reveals, patient as stone, waiting for someone to ask the right question and finally look beneath.